Well, good morning. In all honesty, this is probably the toughest passage I've ever had to speak on. That's why I'm going to pray first. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. These texts, that is, the letters to the churches in Revelation, are really, really tough to read and really, really tough to speak about, because the book of Revelation is an extremely misunderstood book. It's highly symbolic, and it uses highly specific imagery for a particular group of people that is vastly separated from us in time and space and circumstance. And perhaps the hardest thing about it, it says things that I wish it really didn't say. And not only that, as we move from the first letter to the church in Ephesus, to the second letter to the church in Smyrna, and now the third letter to the church in Pergamum, Jesus' messages are becoming increasingly cryptic. And reading this passage just kind of spins your head. It's like you're eavesdropping on an alien telling a joke to their friends. It's just full of references that don't make any sense, and we're pretty clueless about these things. So I'm going to read it for you, and perhaps what's going to strike you is just how crazy it sounds. This is Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 to 17, to the church in Pergamum. To the angel of the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. I know where you live, where Satan has his throne, yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Therefore, repent. Otherwise, I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. Makes sense, right? Makes sense. A very important thing to remember that this message is not for us. It's not for us. It's for the church in Pergamum. If it was a message for the people in Halifax, it would be full of highly Haligonian symbols. Pick your symbol. Maybe you would talk about Africville, wave statues, donairs, moose heads, and someone reading it 2,000 years from now would have no idea what it's talking about. If it seems like this letter is written in code, it's because it kind of is. But the Christians in Pergamum would understand the code. Even though it's not for us, I kind of feel like the message is for me. I'm going to tell you why. Because we had this idea of doing a sermon series on the letters of the churches in Revelation, and you know what? We were going to start it not in January. We were going to start it in September. Kick off the year, right? But then we looked at it and we thought, yeah, this is really tough, and this is really intense and really difficult, and we need a little bit more time to prepare. And I was slated to preach sermon number 4, the 4th letter, to the church in Thyatira. I was doing my research, and actually that one is, I would say, harder than this one even. And so I was starting to get comfortable with it, doing my research. But then guess what? We switched, and we're going to do this in January instead. So I thought, oh man, well, my research is kind of out the window. I put all this work into it, and but okay, I guess I'm on Pergamum now. So I started my research over, and I thought, no, do I have any resources? Do I have anything helpful for me? And I was kind of floundering because it's a very challenging passage. So I looked in I have like an online library. I have like a tablet. I have like these books, these Kindle books that I buy. And just looking absent-mindedly through the relatively small number of books I have on there. And then I gasped. Because I had a book that I had bought about 2 years ago. I don't even remember buying it. Didn't even know what it was about. And the book was called The Lost Letters of Pergamum. And I had this on my virtual shelf. Oh, okay. That's why I'm doing this one instead. Because I already have the book. So I felt like it was sort of meant to be. That book, I highly recommend it. It's an imaginary dialogue of letters between Antipas, mentioned in our letter, and Luke, as in Dr. Luke, who wrote the gospel. So I feel like it's for me, but I'm up here and I still have to say there's a lot that I don't understand still. And you know what? I'm not even going to try to interpret it for you. It's too tough. It's not even the main point. Besides, there's too many interpretations. That white stone thing, there's like 10 different interpretations about that. Hey, it's a fun puzzle for you. We need a puzzle during a snowstorm, right? So when you go home, check it out. Also, I don't know what it means. It's still too challenging for me. But even though the message is not for us, I mean, why are we even bothering, right? Well, because there's nothing really new underneath the sun, right? Our issues are different than Pergamum, but maybe there's an overlap. Maybe there's something we can learn. Maybe even the Jesus who spoke to them is the same Jesus that speaks to us. So, a quick little history lesson. Because if you're going to listen to these letters, you got to know who he's talking to. So 3 things to know about the city of Pergamum, which I had never heard of. I'd never heard of Pergamum before. I don't know about you. Pergamum is the capital. It's the capital of Asia. And by Asia, I mean Turkey. I know that's confusing. That's what they called Turkey. It was the capital city. It had many, many claims to fame. It is the greatest. It is the most famous of all the 7 churches, all the 7 cities that we're talking about in this series. What are its claims to fame? So let me tell you, it has the 2nd biggest library on the entire planet. Big library. They're really into learning. They're really into culture. They're really into books. It was an administrative center. All the power, all the organization for that whole province of Asia, it all flows from this city. And it had sort of this, maybe call it a magic reputation. If you were sick, if you had a problem, if you had a disability, you know where you go? You go to Pergamum because they have this magical pool, and if you go swimming in the pool, you'll be cured of your ailments. It was kind of like the city of Lourdes, Lourdes. That's where you go for healing, right? This is a famous, powerful, magical city. Number 2, it was the center of Caesar worship, the center of the emperor cult. And actually, that's something I learned, that this whole emperor worship, it's actually a new thing. In Jesus' day, even in Paul's day, not really a thing. Yes, the emperor, very important. But since even Paul, it's only 30 or 40 years after Paul, since then, new emperors have come up, and they have made themselves gods in a new way. They have deified themselves, and they've made themselves the center of the moral universe. And you know what? This sounds crazy. You can even think in the last 100 years, and in fact, even shorter periods of time, where leaders do, this is what some leaders do, right? They come to power and they make themselves everything. They almost make themselves gods. They make themselves the most important thing about society, about culture, about religion. They take worship of themselves and they embed it into everyday practices, your religious practices, your financial practices, your social practices. They're the glue that holds everything together. They're the word on everyone's tongue. They're the basis of every value, every system, emperor. And this new emperor worship system, it's propped up by, and it's propagated out of, the city of Pergamum. This is where it all has its headquarters, at least in this part of the Mediterranean. In fact, if you lived in that part of the world, once a year you have to travel to Pergamum for a little ritual. You stand before a magistrate and you say, "Caesar is Lord." And they say, "Okay, you're good to go," and you go back home. This is where it takes place. I think of certain American cities that have sort of this kind of grip on culture. Like I think of how Washington, D.C., it's the center of political power. I think of New York, it's the center of economic power. Los Angeles, the center of maybe say cultural power, entertainment power. Pergamum is the center of empire power. It's the center of Caesar worship. Number 3, this is a violent and threatening place if you're a nonconformist. This is a very scary city to live. Even visibly, their landscape, you can imagine the city is in this kind of a valley down below, but looming over the landscape, an enormous mountain that just stares down at you. And on top of that mountain, very visible, an absolutely enormous temple to Zeus. And it's just kind of staring oppressively down at you. If you don't conform, then you have got the mountain to deal with, this kind of thing. And this city, not only visibly intimidating, but this city has a very unique ability. They have something called the power of the sword. And Rome gave this power to only a small handful of cities. And they say, you know, in your city, you can kill anybody you want. Anyone who crosses the line, you have the right to put them to death. You don't have to go to the Supreme Court, basically. You don't have to bring the trial all the way to Rome. If someone steps out of line, you can just make that call yourself. And you know what? The Christians who didn't attest that Jesus is Lord, this is what they were faced with. This is the kind of threat that's against them. They could be killed on the spot. They could have their life ruined. They could be thrown into like gladiatorial combat. And actually, if you read this letter, Jesus mentions somebody who died for their faith. And in all 7 letters, this is the only person mentioned. This is the only name drop. We're told that there's a guy named Antipas, and he's killed for his faith. Imagine if someone in your Christian community was killed for their faith. That is so hard to imagine in the West. But it just shows you that this city, this church, they lived on a knife edge. This is a perilous, scary, traumatic place to live. I can't overstate it. What a scary place to be a Christian. But you know what strikes me perhaps the most is when I tell you about how powerful this city, how famous this city was, how influential this city was. You know what strikes me? I'd never heard of it. I almost knew nothing about it. Any of you guys know anything about Pergamum? Probably not. I'd hardly ever heard the name mentioned in my entire life. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall. They come and they go. The kingdom of God carries on. The kingdom of God that is often invisible and is not aligned with the strength and powers of the world, that's the one that stands the test of time. I mean, the city fell. I mean, it still exists in a way, but it's only a few thousand people right now. All that greatness that they had, it's all temporary, sort of an illusion. And you know what's left in our popular imagination of the city of Pergamum? You know how the city of Pergamum has kind of made their mark on the world? If you can read that, this is a box of parchment paper that I literally pulled out of the garbage this week. And this is the Spanish, it's a Spanish side. There's the English side. There's the Spanish side. It says Pergamino. There you go. So that's where Pergamum invented parchment, I should say. And so the word parchment actually comes from the word Pergamum. They're almost the same word. And so even in Spanish, I think that's Spanish, the word is right there. And pergamino, you can say how it became parchment, but this is sort of the symbol, I think, of the greatness of the power of Pergamum. It's just parchment paper. It's just crumpled up in the garbage now. I find this a very striking example of this great city and kind of what they've come to nowadays. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what message could Jesus possibly have for a church living on the threat of death in an incredibly powerful city? His one sentence kind of evaluation: well, some of your churches have remained faithful. Good for you. Thank you. You're still faithful, even in the threat of death. But some of you, perhaps read between the lines, most of you, are compromising. You're compromising. Some of you are faithful and some of you are compromising. He certainly affirms the one who stayed faithful. This is a very difficult place to be faithful in. But some communities, I'm imagining like particular house churches perhaps, they're living, they're gathering, and they're behaving in ways that they cooperate, just a bit too much with the status quo, with the culture, with the Caesar worship system, with empire obsession, empire oppression. Compromise consists of two things for this community: eating meat sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. What great and fun things to talk about on a Sunday morning. So there's a little bit of a confusion about what these actually mean. Some scholars think these are two separate issues, and they're two problems, but they're two separate issues. And some scholars actually say, well, actually, they're actually the same issue, kind of put together. So I'll talk about them first separately, and then I'll talk about them together. Taken separately, eating meat sacrificed to idols, we don't do that, at least in the West, although it actually is a part of cultures outside of the West, certainly. It's a super normal thing to do in the New Testament time. And actually, not only is it a super normal thing to do, it's a very gray area for Christians of that day. It was one of those practical things where different people had different opinions. Should you do it? Should you not? And, yes, Jesus condemns it pretty strongly. Paul also speaks against it. But it's one of those conundrums that a lot of people, they didn't know what to do. Should they eat the meat that's been sacrificed? It all came down to, should you engage in worldly practices to fake gods if it'll help you kind of fit more smoothly into society? If it'll help, make that relationship just a little less tense and maybe give you the little leg up over the other guy if you're going to get that promotion. It's just one of those things that people thought, well, is it really that big of a deal if I eat the meat? And I can think of very few comparables in today's society, but there are certainly gray areas still for a lot of people. Should you listen to music if the person who made the music has become a public disgrace? Should you buy the products from a company that we know utilizes slave labor in another country? Or maybe you find their branding to be sort of objectifying, like you're just buying their stuff, right? What's the harm? Should you watch a movie that's explicit? Actually, these are areas that people disagree on because they feel like sort of gray areas. And you may think, okay, those are not very big deals, but maybe the person sitting next to you is like, well, those are very big deals. And that's just that's just what it was like for Pergamum. It's a gray area, and it was a really tricky thing to know whether you should do it or not. Because it was so normalized, it was such a big part of kind of operating within society that if you didn't do it, if you abstained from it, you were risking ostracism and even economic insecurity if you choose not to do this. This is all connected to the system of Caesar worship in the time. And in this kind of highly polarized time back then, you could very easily be identified as an enemy of the state if you didn't do this. And so you can understand the risks. And so for this reason, Christians, and I have some sympathy, very understandably, they weighed the pros and cons. And they thought, well, I think I'm going to decide to partake. I think I'll do it because self-preservation, I got to stay alive, I got to feed my family. Social advancement, that's a good thing, right? If I eat the meat, and actually if I eat the meat at this gathering, then I'll curry favor with the powerful people, and who knows where those connections will take me. And maybe they just did it because they thought it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal if I do it. Yeah, Jesus has another evaluation. He says it's spiritually dangerous. I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's what I'm reading between the lines, and that's what I'm thinking he's saying. Regardless of whether you believe in these gods, and by gods I mean the gods of the idol statues sort of represented. Some people believe in them, and some people they didn't. They didn't believe in those gods. They just thought they were statues. They're engaging in a dark and mysterious practice. And they're inviting evil forces into their lives. This is kind of the biblical worldview of idols. And some people might say that it's kind of harmless to engage with these idols. But the Bible speaks of idols as a very dangerous thing. In fact, N.T. Wright says the biggest problem, according to the Bible, in society is not sin. It's idolatry. Idolatry, which leads to sin. And it's incredibly dangerous. And it's dangerous not just because, you're doing something immoral, not just because you're breaking one of the 10 Commandments or you're worshiping something other than the living God, but it's dangerous because if you do this, it's going to take away from who you are in some way. It's actually going to distort your humanity, and it's going to enslave you. It's a very strong language, but that's the worldview of the Bible. And when we think of idols now, we don't think of statues, we think of the big three: money, sex, and power. And if you actually think about those things, it's easier to imagine how if you were to pursue those things with your whole heart, if you were really to give in 100% of yourself to the pursuit of those things, you can imagine how it can kind of knock you out of whack. It can hinder you from being your full image of God self. And it can actually keep you captive to pleasures and to promises, which are ultimately empty but still possess a massive draw on our hearts. I think idols are something to ponder every once in a while. Even though they're a strange part of ancient culture, they are still in our life. I think idols that I personally have, things that I can easily find myself worshiping, idols of success, productivity, approval, the approval of other people, and even peace in that a lack of conflict. You don't want to ruffle any feathers. You don't want any trouble. You just want to keep everything nice and calm. Actually, these are some personal idols, I think. It's spiritually dangerous. Sexual immorality, of course, it's a troubling thing. And trouble for me is, I don't know what it means. It's a very, very broad term. And heck, we know very well that in our culture there are different definitions of that, and actually in their culture as well, vastly different definitions of what you might call sexual immorality. So here's what I can say with some certainty about what this might mean. Whatever was happening, it was physically dangerous because it came out of a lack of respect for the body, and it put people in all sorts of compromising situations. And that's I get that because when he says the teaching of Balaam and the teaching of the Nicolaitans, that's where this kind of idea comes from, a lack of respect for the body. It's physically dangerous. And maybe we think of our own culture. We can easily paint our culture with the brush of hypersexualization. It's probably nothing compared to this culture. I don't even want to imagine it. But the attitude towards sexuality, totally different than ours. I'm different from what we might call the right's attitude towards sexuality, and even different from the left's attitude toward sexuality. There was a certain strain of thinking back then, and it made its way into the church that it failed to appreciate the nature of the human body, that simply labeled the human body as flesh and blood, but the body's also a spiritual thing. We're spiritual beings in our wholeness. And when the body is commodified, objectified, hypersexualized, or simply treated as a means to an end or a gateway to pleasure, this is a really harmful thinking. And there were festivals in the city of Pergamum. They're ingrained into the calendar, into the social rituals, and they celebrated sexual abandon. They celebrated kind of a freewheeling, and you can just imagine husbands cheating on their wives, vice versa. You can imagine shady backroom encounters, abuses left, right, and center, and this beautiful gift from God, sex, is cheapened, and it's commodified, it's objectified, and it's used to harm people. People were being hurt. That's the bottom line, and Jesus does not want to see people being hurt. I think that's actually all I want to say about sexual immorality right now. But, it's a problem. It was a problem for them. Taken separately, you can see the issues are a problem. Some people actually think, some scholars think, well, actually these two issues are the same issue. I'll explain, because there was a particular practice in that time where you get together with your friends and you host a great meal that's a memorial for the dead. And actually, you take that phrase, meat sacrificed to idols, in the Greek, that could easily be translated memorial meal for the dead. And you can imagine that at these meals, the heavy drinking, it degenerates into an immoral affair. And there are religious pressures to make this happen, cultural, financial, social, and all these pressures and expectations, they combine, and they create this event that is deeply corruptive of society. It breaks all sorts of relationships, and it's deeply harmful for people. However you want to think of these two issues, they're deeply harmful and dangerous things. And that's why not only are they spiritually or physically dangerous, but they're systemically dangerous. And systemic is a word that we've heard a lot of in the past 3 years. These practices are they're part of this bigger machine, this give and take of an honor and shame culture, where you had to just one-up the other guy. You had to beat down the other guy. It's a zero-sum game because you're trying to gain favor in the eyes of the world. And they're part of this culture that really like to draw lines about who's in, who's out, who's worth something, who's worth nothing. These practices are part of an oppression. They oppress people who didn't fall in line, who didn't conform. Maybe that's Christians, but maybe that's a foreigner or a slave or a widow. They're part of this system which we have in our world today, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It rewards vice over virtue and selfishness over service. And these practices, they reinforce the story, the narrative that the empire is telling about what it means to live a good life in a glorious society in service to a perfect, beautiful emperor. And for a Christian to partake in these practices was to basically signal your compliance with the imperial cult. It signaled that you were part of the machine. And it involved a compromise in what is supposed to be your singular devotion to Jesus. Jesus tells us you cannot serve both God and money. Fill in the blank. You cannot serve both God and sex, power, Caesar. You got to pick one. Jesus, in his letter, is not just speaking to the ordinary citizens of Pergamum who did all these shady things. He's speaking to his church, the very group that's supposed to bear his name, be his body. Now, how on earth did these dangerous ideas or practices make their way into the church of all places. It's supposed to be a bastion of truth and purity, right? As we know, it's not always the case. Just because there's an idea out there in culture doesn't mean that it's not going to make its way into the church. If it's in the air that we breathe out there, when the doors open, the air comes in and we breathe it in here too. And the way that dangerous ideas make their way into the church, perhaps one way, is they get wrapped up in religious language that makes them seem like gospel. It makes them seem justifiable. And I think there's so many of these false narratives, these false ideas that are out there that are associated with Christianity today, and they seem quasi-religious. If you squint your eyes a little bit, they kind of seem like gospel, but they're pretty dangerous. So here are a few, and these are my own personal opinions, but I think these are quasi-religious ideas that have a lot of danger associated with them. One of them is the idolization of freedom as the ultimate value. We can certainly think in the news this week, this weekend, freedom being held up as the be-all and end-all. And I think that's dangerous. Or the idea out there that my individual rights are more important than anything else, even safety, the safety of other people. Or this idea that violence or verbal combativeness, it's worth it if it helps you get your way. How about this one? Christians are in a war against pick your people group, pick your issue. It's there. How about people only deserve love if they agree with you? In fact, the enemy is the person who doesn't look like you, doesn't talk like you, and doesn't believe like you. I can keep going. I will. The idea that being right or convincing others of your side is the most important thing, and when you walk away from an argument, you better make sure you won that argument. How about the best life is one that is happy, wealthy, successful, busy, sexy, full of stuff, new. Or this idea that the gatekeepers of truth in our society are the celebrities or the charismatic people. They must know what's really going on. We should listen to them. How about the idea that bad things happen to people because God is judging them for their sin? That's a pretty heavy idea. These are narratives that are out there that I find appealing at times, and I think narratives that have a particular way in my heart are these ideas that change is bad. Conflict is bad. The easiest way is the best way. And you got to be independent. You don't want to be too dependent on other people. All of these ideas are associated peripherally with Christianity in today's world. And all of them are harmful in their own way. A lot of them prop up systems of oppression, and a lot of them at their core come down to idol worship and self-enslavement. All of them give glory to dark forces instead of God. All of them are essentially a compromise, and that they fall short of the life lived according to the gospel of a crucified Messiah and then a risen Messiah. When people in the church embrace practices that are harmful, it's like they're living a double life. They might live one life on Sunday, one life at home, one life on Facebook, another with your friends. And Jesus is calling his church, you live one life, not two lives. When I was working my summers at Malagash Bible Camp, there was a particular practice that I was really looking forward to as I started my first summer on full-time staff, is because you got to do your laundry at camp, right? You got to do your laundry, but you have 12 other people to share the laundry machine with, so y'all got to take turns. Y'all need your different day of the week We all need a laundry schedule. And so you put up this plaque on the wall that says, these are the days of the week when you do your laundry. And instead of just putting up your normal name on the board, the rest of the staff gives you a laundry name. You get this like nickname, a special code name. And every year there's this funny gathering where we all give ourselves these funny names. This is like a 30-year-old practice. Don't tell me, I couldn't tell you where it comes from. And the first year on staff, I was really looking, I bet I'm going to get this really funny name. It's going to be so great. And all the other people got these really funny, great names. But they gave me a name that I was just confused by. The name I got given, One Life. Why did they call me that? And it's because one of the first weekends at camp, someone had a book that they were reading called One Life. And what's that book about? I asked, and I devoured it in a weekend. I thought, this is a really interesting book. And that's what they named me after. That's not very exciting. I was probably begrudging my lame nickname compared to other people's funny nicknames. And at the end of that summer, I think camp was all wrapped up. I remember the staff, we went on a walk down the beach, and as we were coming back, we were wading through knee-high water, and I remember having a conversation with another staff member, and you share the struggles of your life and the things you're hoping for about the future. And I remember saying something along the lines of, in many ways, I feel like I live two lives. I live a life at camp, I live a life at high school, or at that time I was worried I was going to live two lives going into university the next year. And I said something like, well, I guess I really hope that I live one life this fall. And then it kind of hit me, right? Oh, that's why I got the nickname. That's what God was doing, reminding me of the calling that I think he's given me. And that's our calling too. So just live one life. And now Jesus gets a little more intense. I'll go back to the passage here. He's challenged to the people who live two lives, repent. That's kind of his challenge in all the letters. Repent. Don't do it. Stop. Turn around. Or else risk my sword. Okay, I do not think of swords when I think of Jesus. I think of him as a pacifist. This language is stark and it's simple and it's confusing, but you know what? It's language that the people in Pergamum would have understood. The symbol of Pergamum, it's a sword. The city had the power of the sword. They had power over life and death. And Jesus is saying, no, they don't. I've got the power over life and death. And note that when the New Testament talks about swords, they usually don't mean actual swords. Usually they mean the Word of God. The sword is a symbol for the Word. And actually, Jesus calls it the sword of my mouth. His words cut people to the heart. Cut people going in and they cut people going out. They convict people of sin. They challenge them to their core. And they invite people into God's love and life. It's a word that is harsh and gentle. And while the Christians who are compromising in Pergamum, they're afraid of the actual sword, Jesus says, you should be afraid of my sword, my word that has the actual power over life and death. He says, if you have an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, what my sword word says. And he says, if you stay faithful, and many of you have, there's a reward for you. And the reward is myself. To the people that chose Jesus and Jesus alone, they get Jesus and Jesus alone. He offers them in this passage hidden manna. And I don't know what that means, but what it makes me think of is Jesus as the bread of life. Jesus as the sustenance for a starving people in the wilderness of persecution. And the hope of a future kingdom banquet for the conquerors. The hope that you really need when your present is bleak and frightening. The Revelation is a scary, scary book. Or at least it looks scary. And this Jesus is a scary, scary Jesus, or at least he looks scary. But it's an important thing to keep in mind that the Jesus who speaks so strongly and harshly to these people is the same Jesus we read about in the Gospels. This is the Jesus who'd rather die for his enemies than kill his enemies. He spent his life in service to the marginalized, and he sought their well-being above his own, even if it means he walked right into persecution himself. This Jesus is the image of God who we are called to be. He's the true representation of who God is, and I say that because it means he's the anti-idol. He's not a paltry little representation of a weak, fake God. He's the real deal. He's the anti-idol. Instead of oppressing, he empowers. Instead of distorting, he humanizes. And instead of enslaving people, he sets them free. He heals, restores, and renames. And our passage today, if you noticed a little thing about a white stone that he gives to people that are faithful, it's the new name part that I want to focus on. There's so many interpretations about what this might mean. I don't know what it means, but I'll say this. I think of white. I think this is a new start that he's giving to his people, and he's giving them a new name, and that is a very typical behavior of God the Father in the Bible. He gives people a new name. People that are struggling, people that are persecuted, people that are conflicted, new name, new journey, new life. And I just mention that right now because probably a lot of us feel convicted or feel sort of weighed down by these words about compromise. Because we all compromise. We all compromise. And Jesus is giving us a fresh start. He's giving us a new name. He offers that to us as individuals, but he even offers it to us as a church that is always in need of a fresh start. And Jesus gives that to us. I know I told you I wouldn't get into decoding some of these things, and I've already failed in that. But I'm going to end with one more little fun one, because I think there's one word in the letter that sort of summarizes the whole message, and if you pay close enough attention. I think it reflects perfectly on the experiences of the faithful in Pergamum. Like I said before, there's only one person mentioned in all 7 letters. One person mentioned, and his name is Antipas. We know nothing about Antipas. So this is all speculation here, but follow the logic. Where have we heard that name before? Antipas. It's like New Testament trivia here. Oh, that's right. Wasn't that Herod's last name? King Herod, like the one who persecuted Jesus and sent him to Pilate and back and forth? Okay, so this is a Jewish king, so this guy's probably Jewish, Antipas. But he's named after a king, so he's probably from like a wealthy pro-Roman Jewish family. Because Herod, Antipas, was a pro-Roman king. So you can imagine a Jewish man from a wealthy sort of elite family, and exactly the kind of person you'd expect to be kind of wheeling and dealing in a great Roman city like Pergamum. You can imagine he spent his life pursuing power and influence. He builds up honor and he shuns shame. And then something happened to him. We're told that Antipas was a faithful witness who was killed among his people. Well, how did that happen with a name like Antipas? Well, you can just imagine him walking into a house church one day in Pergamum, perhaps by happenstance, perhaps invited by a slave, by a foreigner, who knows. And maybe he's moved by the generosity, or he's moved by the compassion, or he's moved by the countercultural hospitality that they offer him, or the way that they have this boundary-breaking kind of code of conduct. And you can imagine him over time, perhaps, encountering Christ in these places. And at some point, he decides to change courses. He forsakes his old way of strength and influence, and he starts embracing a new way of weakness, humility, love. And because Antipas was likely a very powerful public figure, I'm getting that from his name alone, you can imagine that he would have met his end pretty quickly once word got out that he had decided that Caesar was no longer Lord and actually that Jesus is Lord now. And that's quite the transformation. It's a Christ-like journey the downward journey. And that's a man whose name that we remember. His name is etched into history like it's written on a white stone. And his name is forever remembered, unlike the name of Pergamum, the great kingdom who is all but forgotten and kind of crumpled up like old parchment paper. Thanks for being with me. This has been a challenging passage and quite the journey. I'll end with Jesus' words. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Amen.